Greetings and welcome back. In the last mini lecture, I talked about Congress and the Constitution and primarily elaborated on the Great Compromise, which, remember, vested power kind of equally between the large and the small states. The Senate, of course, is the small state chamber. All states are represented equally. All states have two senators. And so a majority of Americans are only represented by 18 senators, and a minority of Americans are represented by 82 senators. On the other hand, the nine most populous states have a majority of House seats. Uh, it is the large state chamber. And so the intriguing thing there is, remember, for a bill to become a law, it has to pass in both chambers in identical form. Talked about how there's reapportionment every 10 years after a census. We are undergoing a census right now in 2020. My guess is there is not going to be a significant change in representation. My guess is that once again, Texas and Florida and perhaps Georgia, I've also heard perhaps North Carolina, even Virginia may pick up a representative. There may also be a representative added in Arizona, Washington. But notice that over the last 30 years, every single state that has gained representation has been in either the South or the West. And the states that have been losing representation, the big losers after the last three censuses have been New York, Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Michigan, that old Rust Belt. So southern states are gaining, western states are gaining, eastern and northern states are losing. I also talked about how Congress is not very representative of American society as a whole, whether it is gender, whether it is race, whether it is wealth, whether it is age. Congress is very unrepresentative of American society as a whole. Today I want to scroll down to tenure. House members serve only a 2-year term, and I think that this is one of the reasons why reelection is such an important goal. When critics talk about congresspersons in a virtual state of reelection, well, of course, given only a 2-year term limit, Congress is in a perpetual state of reelection because they're either preparing for an election, actually running in the election, or doing a post-mortem on the last election. So, my recommendation, if we were going to pass a constitutional amendment, might be to increase House tenure to 4 years and have it at midterm time. So in 2020, we have a presidential election. 2022 will be a midterm election. And then 2024 will be the next presidential election. It's not going to happen. But certainly, I think for critics who are complaining that the House of Representatives is perpetual reelection, one way to change that would be to increase their term to 4 years, which I wouldn't mind, but I know the vast majority of Americans are opposed. Now, contrast House members who serve only a 2-year term. The entire House of Representatives, all 435 of them, are up for re-election every 2 years. And contrast that with the Senate. Senators serve a significant term of office. They are in office for 6-year terms. Once again, there are no term limits, so a senator can serve there essentially for life if they can win re-election. But notice that unlike the House of Representatives, where all of them are up for re-election at the same time, this is not true in the Senate. Senate terms are staggered. They are staggered. 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. This was done to limit the impact of temporary or transient changes in public opinion. And so as a result, about 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. Your book doesn't talk about this, but since we have an election coming up, I will mention that in this current election, a majority, about 2/3 of the seats that are up for re-election are Republican seats. And so if you're listening to the news media talking about the upcoming election in November, almost every pundit is saying that they expect the Democrats to pick up a couple of seats. Now, they need 4 seats to take over, and I would say that at most, unless something crazy happens, that's probably the most the Democrats will pick up. I think there's no question that the Democrats will pick up a seat, 2 seats, maybe 3. It's possible 4. And the reason for that is that the Democrats have 1 seat that is incredibly vulnerable in Alabama. The Republicans have a seat that appears to be very vulnerable in Arizona. I also think they have a seat that's very vulnerable in Colorado. I mentioned that one earlier. Um, but then after that, keep in mind that incumbents have a significant advantage. That on average, senators seeking reelection are going to spend 9 million or more in California because our state is so large and because media time is so expensive, especially in Los Angeles, San Diego, and the Bay Area, that often a Senate race in California will cost over $20 million, maybe even $30 million. So it's very, very expensive. And so just a forecast, you can always email me next semester if I get this wrong. It's a long way out, a lot can happen. But if I were to make a prediction, I would say that the Republicans barely hang on in the Senate, and the Democrats, I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say they're going to pick up 3 seats in the Senate. We'll see what happens. Scroll down to requirements. There aren't many requirements to be a House member or a senator. The only one that I will ask on the exam in terms of requirements are that House members have to be at least 25 years of age. Senators have to be 30 years of age. There's also a citizenship requirement, but I'm not going to get into that. Both the House and the Senate are currently directly elected by the people, but that has not always been true. Originally, if you read the original Constitution, senators were selected by state legislatures, and underline that. You are likely to see that on the exam. I'm prone to ask originally who selected senators, and it was not the people directly. So I told you that originally the founding fathers were leery of you and I. They believed that we were ruled by our emotions and our passions and not by our intellects. So originally, only the House of Representatives was directly elected by the people. Senators were selected by state legislatures. The president was selected by the Electoral College. And Supreme Court justices were nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Now that changed. And if you take a look at the 17th Amendment, and you should know that, you know that when I mention amendments, I like to ask amendments on exams. It is the 17th Amendment that provided for direct election of the Senate in 1913. Some states, especially in the West, allowed for direct election of the Senate before the passage of the 17th Amendment. California is certainly an example of that. If you go down to number 5, Congress and committees, I just want to say a few things here. And that is, if you want to see Congress at work, watch Congress and committees. It's not in empty chambers with people giving speeches. I mentioned earlier that Congress is a frustrating chamber, that less than 7% of bills since World War II, and that's a long time, 75 years. In the last 75 years, less than 7% of bills have been enacted into law. Your book says 6%. I told you earlier that there has been increased polarization in Congress that's made compromise difficult, that there has also been an increase in divided government over the last 50 years, and we certainly see that right now, where the Democrats are the majority party in the House and the Republicans are the majority party in the Senate. But here is the dilemma. Here is what makes this whole topic so darn difficult, and that is that political parties are at the very core of legislative business in the United States. It is hard to think of governing without political parties. Political parties are one of the two major linkage institutions to government. You and I, as citizens, are linked to government through two institutions. One is political parties. Remember, political parties engage in both lobbying and electioneering. Political parties not only want to lobby and push policies, but political parties want to elect their members to office. They want to actually be the government. And so when we talk about a nomination, right, that Joe Biden is the presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party, a nomination is merely a party endorsement. And so Congress is organized on a partisan basis. That means that the majority party has a majority on every committee in Congress. The majority party controls every chairmanship of every committee. And so political parties are the basis of organization, and yet they are the basis of frustration at the same time, and it makes Congress very, very paradoxical. So that's the first linkage institution. The second linkage institution are interest groups. I introduced you to the theory of pluralism, the notion that in this case, government responds to citizens that are organized into groups. The primary difference between a political party and an interest group is that an interest group does not want to elect their member to Congress. They're not electing their member to be president. They are trying to lobby the government to pass legislation or to prevent legislation from being passed. So they engage in lobbying. They do not engage in electioneering. And yet, obviously, these interest groups are very powerful. They have huge money. They organize. They support incumbents primarily because interest group leaders know that the people who are most likely to win elections are incumbents. And so that's why they form political action committees, and often they support incumbents in larger numbers than they do challengers. Interest groups with a whole lot of money, what they do is they actually kind of butter their bread on both sides. It's been well known that there are interest groups who contribute significant amount of money to both Democrats and Republicans. And then at various stages will try to work with whoever happens to win. In the next mini lecture, and I'll just forecast it in the minute that I have left, I'm going to talk about committees. When I think about committees, in my mind, committees serve as screening devices. It is the committees that also are really islands of specialization in Congress. And I'm going to talk about standing committees, which are, in my opinion, the basic working units of Congress. Conference committees, these are temporary committees that reconcile conflicting versions of a bill. Usually legislation is passed in a different form in the House and the Senate, so these conference committees have to iron out the differences. And then the Rules Committee, which I believe is the major institutional difference between the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives has a Rules Committee, and the Senate does not. And I'll talk about why that is so important in the next lecture. Have a wonderful day.